So I know the last thing you think you want is a list of recommendations of books that women should read about men, but I'm giving it to you anyway. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to another one of my videos where I list 11 books that I think people should read, or sometimes 11 books I think people shouldn't read or don't need to read. But in this case, these are 11 books about men, by men, that I think women might think about reading in order to gain a little more insight about men, at least as they're presented in fiction. I don't know how much insight you can gain about men in general. Now, I did a video similar to this last week, which was 11 books that high value men should read that are about women, written by women. So I thought this would be kind of a nice companion piece, even though I realized, or I felt immediately as soon as I decided to do this, I was on a lot shakier ground here. Because the truth of the matter is, because literature, at least in the Western world, has been dominated by men for so long, you may find this list to be superfluous or not necessary. And certainly, my semi-clickbaity approach to the title may be putting you off. But if not, and you're at least interested in hearing which books I have to recommend here, then stick around as I go through these 11 books. So the first 11 books I think are good books about men, written by men, is A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. Now, I know what you're saying. You're off to a bad start here, starting with a well-known misogynist who many people have had to read. And I just want to make an argument in favor of A Farewell to Arms as a book about a male character that I think is a good book and is well written. I think it's Hemingway's most beautifully written novel. But in addition to that, unlike most Hemingway characters, the main character here, Lieutenant, what's his name, Henry or whatever his name is, the lieutenant character in this book grows over the course of the book. He goes from being a relatively silly, vain, womanizing man to a man who falls deeply in love and suffers real tragedy. And I think that character arc is unusual in Hemingway's work. And I think, oftentimes in books, about men, by men, we don't see a whole lot of emotional growth. And I think it's there in A Farewell to Arms. Plus, as I said, I think this is Hemingway's best written novel. The second book on my list would be a real obvious one that lots of people here on BookTube recommend all the time, and that's Lonesome Dove. It's just a great buddy novel. Almost all the characters in it are men, so you get this wide variety of men, from womanizing, gambling, worthless men, to men of questionable character, to men who are too reserved, to men who are too open, to men who are too love-starved, to men who don't have a father figure. And then on top of that, I think you get at least one incredibly good female character in that novel, which really saves it from just being a man's novel, I guess. But really, I think it's a great novel about friendship and devotion and the connection that can exist between men who are very different. And I think for that reason, it's another great book to read. The third book on my list is The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham. The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham is one of those books which I read after having seen a movie adaptation starring Bill Murray, of all people, in the movie adaptation from the 1980s. And so I went into it with certain feelings about it, thinking I knew what it was about, and to a certain extent I did. But what we see here in Larry Darrell, as I think is a young man growing and trying to learn about what he wants from life and what he doesn't want from life, and falling in love and devotion, and being disappointed in love, and then perhaps finding something deeper, something beyond himself, something more important. And I think the book is really good at that. It is in a style I think that some people may find to be a little bit difficult or a little bit strange to kind of get used to. Maugham himself appears as a character in the book, which is somewhat unusual, but I do think it's a really good book for that reason. So the next book on my list is going to be Plain Song by Kent Harif. This is, again, I think a great book in which we see a man who's raising his son in, I believe, Wyoming, and he's a school teacher, and he has, run-ins with parents and students, and trying to figure out how to raise his son, trying to save a young woman who is the victim of sexual and domestic abuse, and there are two older male characters who become involved in this story, which involves all kinds of characters, and really, I think, really beautiful writing and kind of deep emotional connections between these brothers and this young woman and this man and his son. And I just think there's a whole lot of stuff in this book about kind of hidden subtextual emotions, and yet in which we see these men deeply feeling things and, you know, reacting in really caring ways. And I think the book is really good for that reason. The next book on my list, I think this would be the fifth book on my list, is Panenka by Ronan Hession. You may know Hession as wrote one of my favorite books from a few years ago, which was Leonard and Hungry Paul, which is another great book about men, I think. But in this case, I think the book is a little bit more directly about one man who is known as Panenka, who was a soccer player, a football player in Ireland, who made kind of a mistake on a fairly global level, and he was mocked for that, and he allowed that to ruin his relationship with his wife, his relationship with his daughter. And this, in the book, we see him as an older man suffering from real health problems, trying to kind of sort his way through the mess he's made of his life, to rebuild relationships, to make these connections over again, and to have a life separate from that mistake he made in the past. I just think it's a really good look at a man trying to rebuild his life. Next on my list, I have my favorite John Steinbeck novel, which is saying something if you watch my channel, and that's Cannery Row. Cannery Row, as I just think, is just funny. It shows a group of men who are down their luck and poor, and they're trying to help their friend Doc, who is some kind of a biologist or something like that, I believe, by throwing him a party, and they fail, and it's just a mess, and then they try again, and there's a whole lot of just humanity on display in the book. It's short, it's funny. I think the characters are memorable, the incidents are memorable. I think it's you know, there are female characters in the book, and I think there's some kind of poignancy with the way in which they're portrayed, since the main one of them is a prostitute. But I think that there are some good things in the book about these men and about these men's relationship with one another. I lost count now. So the next book on my list would be the Septology. That's actually 3 books by Jan Foss. These are an incredibly beautifully written series of novels focusing on one character, and we are in his mind all the time, in his mind, or, you know, perhaps in his doppelganger's mind, and they share the same name, as he kind of goes over all these memories from his life, childhood tragedies and trauma, success as an artist, friendships, failures, his relationship with his wife, his deep love for his wife, grieving for his wife, his friendship with his neighbor, all these kind of events that kind of circle and come back over and over again, and we see this kind of this relationship with this man who's really religious and very moved by all these things, and it's written in an incredibly hypnotic style, which I found to be incredibly beautiful and effective. And I just think it's a great study of a man looking back on his life, on what's happened, on his relationships, on his mistakes, on his successes and failures, directions his life might have gone. And I just think it's just beautiful. And even though it is never, none of the books in the Septology have ever been my #1 book of the year, it is easily one of the greatest reading experiences I've had over the last 2 or 3 years. Next on my list, I have The Van by Roddy Doyle. This is the second or third in the Berrytown trilogy of novels, which is a humorous series of novels. I've mentioned this one several times. In this one, Mr. Rabbit and his friend Bimbo are going to buy Mr. Chippy Van, and this is during the a World Cup back in the past, I guess in the 90s or the 80s, in which Ireland was having some success, and it's a story kind of a friendship and sports obsession and family, and it really is just in lots of ways kind of joyous and poignant and funny, and I think the friendship there between Mr. Rabbit and Bimbo is a really good one, and really well portrayed, and really just, I think, an enjoyable book to read. The next on my list is Memorial by Brian Washington. Brian Washington's this is his first novel, Memorial. He had a book of short stories called Lot that came out, which had one of my favorite stories in it, really of all time. But Memorial is a novel about two young gay men, one named Benson, who is black, and another named Mike, who is a Japanese American, who have been in a relationship for several years, and you know, the initial spark of that relationship is gone. They still care for one another, but it appears as though this relationship is kind of falling apart. Things get, the strain kind of comes up. Mike's father becomes ill, and Mike goes back to Japan to take care of his father's business. Benson is kind of mysteriously stuck in the home he shared with Mike's mom, who had just come to visit at that exact same moment. And we get to see this kind of exploration of this friendship, I think, or this relationship, which I think is really realistic and kind of shows the way I think sometimes that for men, relationships kind of fall apart, almost erode, rather than collapse in some kind of great big symbolic or big act. I think both men's relationship with their father, with their potential mother-in-law, with one another, with other people are really well drawn. I think it provides a lot of insights into those relationships and in the relationship between those two men. Next on my list is Telephone by Percival Everett. This is kind of, I think, a good novel about a man who is dealing with a personal tragedy in his life and how that kind of drives him to seek some kind of meaning, seek to do something important with his life, almost like a midlife crisis, which leads him in kind of a crazy direction to kind of rescue some people who are in trouble. And it's kind of adventuresome in that way. It's tense in that way. It shows a relationship between father and son, husband and wife, and a man kind of dealing with his own, I think, feelings of inadequacy, inability, impotence, not in a sexual way, to kind of solve problems and to take care of the people he needs to take care of. And I thought it was really, really good, and a really good study of kind of how those things work on a man and work on his relationships. The last book I have on my list is Quiet Flows the Una by Farouk Sahek, and I'm saying his name wrong. I know, I've heard it said, and I cannot keep it in my mind. I'm sorry. This is a book about a man who survives the Yugoslavian Civil War, the war that was fought in Yugoslavia between Serbians and Croatians. Anyway, he survives that, having fought in that war, and there are all kinds of, it's basically told in a series of flashbacks. Sometimes the flashbacks are things in which horrific things are happening to him. Sometimes they're flashbacks to things in which he or his comrades might have done something horrific. Sometimes they're flashbacks to the home of his grandparents on the Una River. Sometimes they're flashbacks to swimming, to fishing, to nature, and it's all kind of woven together, I thought, really beautifully. I know there is a read-along going on with BookTube at War that's starting, I believe, in July. This would be a great choice for that, I think, and I think a really great look at a man trying to recover from being damaged by real traumatic events that took place in his life, which he took part in. So there you go. There are my 11 books about men that I think women should read. If you have any other suggestions, any books you think would be added to that, please put them in the comments below. As always, I look forward to your comments, and thank you for watching.